What's going on, everyone? Welcome to the Week 4 edition of the Ship My Money Show. I'm your host, Adam Scherer. You can follow me on Twitter at ShipMyMoney DFS. And we have a new NFL slate. Looks like a pretty fun one for tournaments, I think. There is some really heavy chalk in, I think, pretty good spots, but also it opens up the door for just a lot of low-owned, decent spots to get to pivot away from. So interested to go through my lineups on this show, take a look at what I'm getting to, what I'm not, how I am navigating a lot of 20 to 30% owned relatively good chalk, I think, on this slate. So looking forward to going through that, taking a look at what my lineups would look like in the millie if the slate were starting right now. I am going to go game by game, looking at my exposures. I think it just works a little bit better for NFL doing it that way instead of basically going through each quarterback and then it being game by game anyway. So I think that makes sense. If you are watching this back a little bit later, you'll be able to see what game I'm on by which games are highlighted here at the top in the filters. So if you're looking for a specific game, you can catch up that way. As always, hit the thumbs up button, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications so you get alerts when shows go live. Obviously, a little bit changing schedule with MLB ending, NBA starting. So turn on notifications so you get those alerts. That'll help you out. But also, as always, throw comments, questions in chat. I will answer what I see if I have an answer for it. So starting with the Rams and the Bears, Kraken said, is there a point of diminishing return for amount of lineups that you make? For example, if you have 450 lineups in 3 different tournaments, sort of. In NFL, I think you can make a lot of really good lineups. So less so in, like on a full NFL slate than on some smaller slates. But to some point, yes, obviously also there's diminishing returns the more lineups you play in a given tournament, since you can only get first place one time. But really it just comes down to, how many plus EV lineups can you make on a slate? And you're never going to know the answer to that before lock, but on a full regular NFL slate, the answer is a good amount, just because there are so many different combinations, so many different options that you can get to. So starting with the Rams and the but there is, obviously a point where you would just run out of those lineups and want to stop playing more lineups. Starting with the Rams and the Bears, I'm not getting to a ton of players from this game. I am getting the Kyren Williams a lot. I do like that here. Not the most appealing game environment going into Chicago, but we've seen Kyren Williams passing game involvement increase without Cooper Kupp, without Puka. I expect that to continue. They just don't have a strong set of receivers at this point. And Kyren Williams has stepped up a bit as a receiver. He's dominating carries out of the backfield still. We haven't seen really any signs of Blake Corum. That was, a concern kind of coming into the season that maybe you would get a little bit more of a split workload now that they drafted Corum, but that hasn't been the case. So workload should be there for Williams. And again, the thing that I do really like is that we have seen the increased passing game involvement for Kyren Williams. That is, of course, especially important on DraftKings where it is full PPR. But in the last 2 weeks, or actually last week, only had about an 8% target share, 18.5% in week 2, 6% in week 1. So I do think at the very least there is the opportunity for him to get more passing game work without these guys. We saw it in week 2. It did disappear a bit last week, but he still had the receiving touchdown. So I do think it does kind of just solidify his floor a little bit from a passing workload standpoint. Obviously, the risk or downside of Kupp and Puka not being out there is that it's just less playmakers in general on the offense. It makes it more likely that you just run into some games where the Rams don't move the ball. They are punting a lot. And that would, of course, be a negative for Williams. But at 7,300, I do like him here. Field's getting 19%. So I'm a little bit ahead of the field at 24%. Bears defense, I'm about 2x. Anybody that's ever heard me talk about DFS knows how little I care about what defenses I'm getting to. Just give me ideally low-owned, cheap defenses and hope for the best. I do like, that you do have a statue quarterback in Matthew Stafford. So, can get some sacks against him potentially. But mostly it's just that they are reasonably priced at 3,100 and they're not getting a ton of ownership. Rams defense getting 20% ownership at 2,800. I have about 8%. I get it. Caleb Williams, the Bears line isn't great. Caleb Williams will give you some turnover opportunities. I get why the Rams are getting ownership, but 20% is a lot for a position that is just so unpredictable and there's so much volatility and actual defensive performance doesn't really line up with fantasy production all that well. Like the tournament winning defense. If you need a specific defense to win a tournament, it's almost always going to be because of a pick six or a kick return or something like that, as opposed to, oh, they just didn't give up points. So the Rams ownership's a little bit surprising to me. I'm not getting to as much as the field. And then Colby Parkinson, there's a million tight ends on this slate between like $3,000 and $4,000 that are basically all the same. They run routes. They're not heavily targeted, but they are potentially end zone threats, and they do dominate the tight end routes on their team. Colby Parkinson that's the case for him with the Rams. Not getting a lot of ownership. I'm not getting a ton, just getting a little bit more than the field. But again, he just looks very, very similar to a lot of other $3,000 to $4,000 tight ends that we'll get to. TTID Forever said he won $3K in the 2-game Monday slate. Awesome. Congrats. I think I got my ass kicked on that slate, but glad that you won. Glad that some people that follow my stuff won. So that's cool. Congratulations on that. Pittsburgh taking on the Colts in Indianapolis. So you do get Pittsburgh going into a dome, which is nice. Justin Fields and George Pickens, I think, are going to look like pretty decent options here. But Najee Harris is the guy getting the bulk of the ownership. He's getting 21% ownership. He's only $5,600. He is going to be playing without Jalen Warren here. So he should get increased work. Now, I do have a concern, and I don't even know if it's a concern. It's what I expect to happen. I think Cordero Patterson is going to be your third down pass catching back. We know how much Arthur Smith likes him. We saw him step up and take on a bigger passing role last week. So I do think that's going to be the case. I'm not anticipating a situation where Harris is just like a true bell cow, but I do obviously expect him to dominate the first and second down work. He will still be involved somewhat as a pass catcher, I'd expect. And then hopefully he's getting the goal line work. That's not a guarantee. Again, we know how much Arthur Smith likes Cordero Patterson, but at this price tag in this spot, I do think he ends up looking pretty good. I'm getting to him about 40%, Fields at 20%. So I do like that. The Colts have this season allowed the 7th most yards before contact to opposing ball carriers as well. So that sets up pretty nicely for Najee also. At 5,600, it's just a good price point. And while I do have concerns about maybe Patterson having a bigger workload than people are probably thinking, I still think it's enough volume for Harris here that he looks pretty good. Justin Fields and George Pickens, as I mentioned, Fields obviously gives you a lot of rushing upside at quarterback, gives you a high ceiling. George Pickens is cheap for somebody that gets as much volume, as much as high of a target share as he does. If Justin Fields gets it done through the air, it's very likely to be to Pickens. This matchup sets up nicely for him as far as defensive coverages for Indianapolis and what Pickens generally does well against. It's in a dome, so again, that looks good. So I am getting a bit over the field on Fields and Pickens, and I like that. Jonathan Taylor, I think, is a pretty interesting tournament play because you're going to have a lot of ownership coming into a few different 7K plus running backs. We already talked about Kyren Williams getting around 20%. Breece Hall is going to be popular. Jordan Mason at 6,700 is going to be popular. And you just have Jonathan Taylor kind of just sitting in this range. Saquon Barkley is going to get ownership at 8K. You have Taylor kind of just sitting in this range getting ignored because those guys do all look a bit better than him when you look at median projections, but the range of outcomes still, Taylor's ceiling is as high as pretty much anybody, and he's not getting a lot of ownership here. So it's not a spot where I think you need to get tons of him. I only have 8%, but it's not going to take much to have more than the field. He's a perfect guy where if you do have lineups that are relatively chalky and you're paying up at running back, you can go to Taylor. You're not sacrificing upside. You're just sacrificing median projection, which isn't the end of the world when you're making up for it by getting not much ownership. Taylor was involved on passing downs again last week, ran a lot of routes. So that was good because week 2, he essentially came off the field. And that was concerning going into week 3, but we saw him back in his normal role last week. So hopefully that continues. Michael Pittman, 3% ownership. I'm getting to 8%. High ceiling, not really any sort of floor when you have Anthony Richardson throwing you the ball. We know he's not the most accurate by any stretch, but he is willing to take shots down the field, and Pittman is not getting much ownership here. He makes sense in, Justin Fields plus Pickens stacks. He makes sense paired with Anthony Richardson, who I'm getting to a little bit here as well. So outside of Najee, nothing from this game that stands out as a true priority to me, but there are spots that I'm just getting a little bit over the field. Pat Freiermuth here at 3,900, another one of the many 3 to 4K tight ends that just sort of falls into lineups because paying down at that position is generally going to be the preferred build, especially with no Trey McBride on this slate. You basically have Kittle, Kelsey, and Bowers as your guys that you'd pay up for. And then, Goddard kind of a little bit more expensive than most of the other tight ends, but still not expensive. So you're going to be paying down a lot, and Fryermuth's going to fall into some lineups there. Denver going into New York, looking like one of the least appealing offenses on the slate, taking on the Jets, who look at least somewhat more appealing here. Not getting to a lot of this game, and it is all on the Jets side, which isn't surprisingly. 20% Breece Hall puts me right in line with the field. We've seen Braylon Allen the last couple of weeks very clearly carving out a role in this backfield. I do expect that to continue because, one, it just helps keep Breece Hall healthy, and two, Braylon Allen's been really, really good. So there's no real reason for him not to be involved. But Breece Hall still should be the clear number one running back here. He's still going to be involved in the passing game, which is really valuable, of course. And the price tag at 7,800 is still fine. Jets likely to be playing with a lead here. I do kind of think that could in some ways be a negative, depending exactly how how big of a lead they're playing with. If this is, like a competitive game, but the Jets are just, consistently up by like 10, then obviously game script wise, that's good for Breece Hall. My concern would be if the Broncos just, don't score and this is just a non-competitive game. I would think that they kind of just like dial it back on Breece Hall and you see some more Braylon Allen. So I don't necessarily think that this is a situation where the Jets being a big favorite is like a guaranteed or super likely positive for Breece Hall, even though he's a running back. But also if they jump out to a big lead, there's a pretty good chance that Breece Hall, has a lot to do with that. Garrett Wilson, not a great matchup. We still haven't seen a big breakout game from him. We've seen teams, Aaron Rodgers talked about it, rolling coverage to Garrett Wilson, forcing other guys like Allen Lazard to beat them, which so far he's been able to do. This is another difficult spot. Patrick Surtain has limited every receiver that he's covered so far this year. Last week, Mike Evans, 1 catch for 8 yards while being covered by Surtain. I assume that you will see him on Wilson a lot. Wilson does move into the slot a good amount, though, so he should be able to get away from him somewhat. And he's still really, really talented. So getting to a receiver that's this talented at low ownership is always going to be pretty appealing, especially when he's only $6,900. But at the same time, I don't love the matchup. There is also the very real threat that the game script is working against Wilson. So I'm pretty much around the field on him, getting a little bit of Aaron Rodgers, but that's about it. Brendan said Broncos defense, only 2,500, should be low scoring. I don't have them. You're never, I don't think, wrong for going to a relatively low-owned, cheap defense. The Jets have one of the higher team totals on the board, though. So don't be deceived by the game having a low total. It's because the Broncos suck, not because of the Jets. So moving on to the Saints and Falcons. Chris Olave hurt his hamstring in practice. I assume he's playing for now. I haven't seen that confirmed or refuted. But if he is playing, I don't really know how to handle that. Don't know if he's 100%. Don't know if he's going to be on any sort of a pitch count. He is obviously really, really good. And if you want to take shots on him at 6,500 at what should be low ownership, I think that's fine. But I'm not really getting to him. I'm getting to the Falcons defense a lot in this one, which I don't love. Obviously, excluding last week, the Saints offense has been very good this year. I think that they're going to be a good offense overall, even though clearly they're not going to sustain what they did through the first couple of weeks of the season. But you do have just a cheap Falcons defense here at home. They're getting 12% ownership, which is a little higher than I'd like. But at 2,600, I'm just getting to them a lot, which isn't the end of the world, even though I would prefer to just kind of be spread out a little bit more at defense. Bijan Robinson, another one of the pay-up options in that 7 to 8K range at running back that looks very good. I'm right around the field at 18% on him. We have seen, Tyler Algier as a clear RB2, getting carries and cutting into Robinson's workload a bit, but Robinson should still be the number one. He's heavily involved. He works in the passing game, all of that. So happy to get to him at 7,400. Darnell Mooney here looks very good at 4,400. We've seen a pretty concentrated target share the last couple of weeks for Mooney and for London. We had the really weird game in week 1 where Ray McLeod just like dominated targets for the Falcons. And basically the only takeaway I could have after week 1 looking at the Falcons was there's no way that anything from this game is in line with what happens going forward. And then the last couple of weeks, it's been more normal where you're getting targets for Mooney, you're getting targets for Drake London, and then McLeod has become your clear wide receiver 3 again. So I think both of Mooney and London do look pretty good here. I'm getting over the field on both of them. I'm getting over the field on Kirk Cousins as well. $5,800 price tag, pair him with Mooney, pair him with London, throw some Bijan in there. And you have really high upside stacks, I think, for Atlanta. Alvin Kamara getting 11% ownership. He is questionable for this one. I got the 6%, 7,600. Again, just a good running back in this price range. There are a lot of good running backs in this price range. There's a lot of good running backs in general. So Kamara is one that I'm getting a little bit less than the field right now, but it's not any sort of a strong take. I don't have, any particular reason that I have less Kamara other than I just am getting to more Robinson, getting to more Hall, getting to more Kyron Williams, but Kamara obviously a perfectly fine play as well. Also, how much Atlanta defense I'm getting to probably has to do with not getting as much Kamara. I don't have any pits to answer TDID's question. I think most of it just has to do with primarily paying down at tight end, also prioritizing Dallas Goedert, who we haven't gotten to yet, but I know he's in a lot of my lineups. And then, when you are paying up, you have Brock Bowers in a good spot without Devontae Adams. You have, Kelsey that you could take shots at. You have Kittle you could take shots at. So Pitts isn't really showing up for me. But from a talent standpoint, if you want to just try and get on the Kyle Pitts game early, that's obviously fine. He's talented. The workload hasn't been there. The passing volume hasn't been there so far this year. Through the first 3 weeks, Pitts has target shares of 11.5, 13.8, and 13.8%. So we haven't seen any real signs of life from him, but we do know he's talented and sooner or later probably will have a good game. Kind of just like the same thing I'm going to have to say about Travis Kelce later, where if you want to take a shot on talented players at low ownership and just hope this is the week, especially at a very, very weak tight end position, there's nothing wrong with that. Like if you get the Kyle Pitts week, there's a decent chance that he just beats every other tight end by like 15 points because they all suck. So that's fine, but it's not the route that I'm taking. I'm just paying down more at tight end. There's a lot of good running backs I want to get to, a lot of good wide receivers I want to get to. I'm fine just saving money at tight end, hoping I land on a touchdown here or there, and that none of the pay up tight ends blow up outside of Goddard. Moving on to Dallas Goedert and the Eagles in Tampa Bay. No A.J. Brown, no Devontae Smith for the Eagles. So this creates what I think is kind of the most difficult situation to project and deal with in DFS. Like obviously not having Devontae Smith, not having A.J. Brown opens up opportunities for other players in this offense, but it also increases the chance that the Eagles offense is just inefficient. It's not like Johnny Wilson and Jahan Dotson and Paris Campbell are going to step in and be the same level of wide receiver that A.J. Brown or Devontae Smith are. So like Dallas Goedert is most likely going to be more involved in the passing game, but it's a matter of, is he getting open? Are the Eagles able to move the ball? At 5,100, pretty good price tag. You can see I'm getting to him a lot. He's in 38% of my lineups right now. Fields at 20%. But there is, risk there that the Eagles just kind of don't really move the ball that well. Same for Saquon Barkley. He's getting 13% ownership. I'm a little over the field at 16%. The bull case for Barkley is that you could see the Eagles just go to a more run-heavy game plan, involve him more, out of the backfield as well, and just really run their offense through Saquon Barkley, which wouldn't be surprising at all. The downside is what I was just saying before, where the Eagles might just not really be an effective offense today, might not be able to move the ball all that well, in which case that's bad for everybody involved. But the upside for Barkley here is really, really high when you factor in not only his talent level and what we've already seen from him in games this season, but also that maybe you just get a more Saquon Barkley centric playbook today as well, game plan today. So I do like Barkley here. I am getting a little bit over the field. Obviously just kind of concerns about this offense in general, but there's no doubting that they have high ceilings with these guys out. Paris Campbell, I thought I'd get a little bit more of at 3K. I do expect him to be somebody that steps up, really benefits from Devontae Smith's absence. We've seen Devontae Smith in the slot a lot this year. I think Campbell will step in, handle those routes. He is only 3K. And so I think from a value standpoint, he is pretty interesting. I am getting to more. I know I'm getting to like more Trey Tucker at 3,600 right now. I think I might have more Elijah Moore also. I'm not positive on that one. But if you wanted to get to some more Paris Campbell, he's not very popular. I do think that he makes some sense here, even though I'm not getting to a lot of him. Chris Godwin, I'm a little bit ahead of the field. 6,800. He's run hot on touchdowns this year, but that hasn't really impacted his price tag. He's still $6,800, so he's still going to look like a pretty good play. He's run about 65% of his routes from the slot this year. That's up from 38% last year. He is a more productive player historically and this season so far when he runs routes from the slot. So that's all good for him. And he still just looks like a good play here at 6,800. A little bit of Tampa defense. I have like a Rashad White lineup, which I don't really want or like, but whatever. We saw Bucky Irving really cut into White's workload last week. I still think that White is the number one running back here for the time being, but I think we're just going to continue trending towards Bucky Irving being the early down back, Rashad White being the passing game back, and it kind of just being a split workload. So White isn't my favorite guy, but he's in 1 out of 50 lineups. I don't really care. There is still obviously a path to him having a good game. Aaron Davis said Joe Mixon is out. So getting to the Jacksonville and Houston game right now, I had Joe Mixon projected in. So I'm not going to have a lot to say here other on running back, other than Cam Akers is 5,300. He dominated the rushing workload for Houston last week. He's not likely to be very involved in the passing game. So you have a cheap running back that's going to get a lot of touches in a game where they are favorites. They do have like a 26 team total. So that is favorable. 64% market share for Cam Akers last week, 21% for CJ Stroud. So when you look at the running back market share, 64% for Akers, 7% for JJ Taylor, 7% for British Brooks, no carries for Daria Gumbawale, Damian Pierce out again. So I do expect the bulk of the carries to go to Akers. What he does with them, obviously, who knows? Not likely to get a lot of passing game work, so you do still have a relatively low floor, but he should handle most of the carries, and he is cheap. So I do like him at least somewhat here, although, again, it is a loaded running back position today. The passing game for Houston's going to look very good. 21% projected ownership coming into Nico Collins, 13% coming into Stephon Diggs. No Tank Dell in this one should just help solidify the workload for those guys. Not that they really need it. Obviously, they're both very heavily involved anyway. Nico Collins is extremely good. Steph Diggs is extremely good. Jags have also been playing man coverage at the highest rate in the NFL through the first few weeks. That is somewhat skewed by like a ridiculous 75% rate in week 1 against Miami, but still the highest overall percentage of man coverage. If they continue doing that, that's going to look pretty good for Nico also. So like both receivers here quite a bit. I'm surprised I'm not getting to Dalton Schultz. I actually think that Tank Dell being out could, from like a marginal standpoint, be a bigger benefit for Schultz than anybody, just because it's opening up more of those middle of the field routes, and you already had a lot of targets going to Collins and Diggs. So I don't really like that I'm not getting to more Schultz. I thought that I would be, but I'm not for whatever reason. He is low owned. He is 4,100. I think he's a good play, even though he's not getting into my lineups right now. So I like the Houston passing game, obviously. And then I'm going to like Akers. I don't have any mix in here. I'm going to like Akers more than I would have liked Mixon, just because he is cheaper and he should just get pretty much all of the touches. The Jacksonville passing game, I think, is going a little bit underrepresented here. You have, Houston's obviously the game that everybody wants to get to, but Jacksonville on the other side of this one, still like a 20 to 21 team total in a dome. Trevor Lawrence has played like shit so far this year, but we know he's capable of being a good quarterback. He has quality pass catchers. The reason that Jacksonville is just kind of going underowned here, though, is that it's very difficult to project this passing game in a way that makes the median projections look really good for wide receivers. You've had a very, very flat distribution of targets so far this season for Jacksonville pass catchers. Nobody on Jacksonville in any game this year has had a target share above 23%. In week 2, Brenton Strange and Gabe Davis were both at 23%. Last week, Christian Kirk led the way at 21.7%. Week 1, it was Kirk, Thomas, and Ingram at 19%. So we haven't had a game yet where one wide receiver just steps up as the clear number one guy. And so when you're projecting this, you end up projecting the passing volume basically to just be evenly spread out to this group of receivers, which makes it so their median projection just doesn't look that great relative to their salary. But their range of outcomes is still favorable at these price points, because within one game, you will eventually just get a Christian Kirk game or a Brian Thomas game or a Gabe Davis game. And so Christian Kirk here getting 8% ownership at only $5,200 in a game where the Jags are likely to be throwing in a high scoring game looks good. Trevor Lawrence at 5,700, paired with Kirk makes sense. Paired with a $5,400 Brian Thomas makes sense. Gabe Davis showing up a little bit for me at 4,700 as well. So I am interested in getting to the Jags passing game. It's also interesting to me that I only have a little bit of CJ Stroud. I thought that I would have more, given how much Nico I'm getting to, given how much Diggs I'm getting to, but it does look like a slate where I am more often than not paying down at quarterback today, and then prioritizing paying up for running backs and wide receivers a bit more. So I think that's why I'm not getting to as much Stroud, but obviously he is a good play here. Also, if the Jags do continue to play a lot of man coverage, then that probably works out pretty well for Stroud. Also, Travis Etienne, another one of these 7K running backs that Isn't getting much ownership, similar ownership to Jonathan Taylor. If you wanted to just kind of throw him into some lineups where you need low-owned, high-upside guys, that's fine. We did see Tank Bigsby come back last week. ETN maintained his week 2 rushing share compared to week 1, where he split more evenly with Bigsby. So hopefully that's a good sign for things going forward, but not any sort of priority, just a high-upside guy. Brenton Strange, another 3 to 4K tight end, got in the end zone last week, but you did see his target share drop to about 11%. I do expect going forward that you'll see the target share in that like 11 to 15% range more often than the 19, 20% range, but still should be used around the goal line. He's only 3,100. He's fine. Not going crazy with him one way or the other. Cincinnati taking on Carolina in Carolina. Andy Dalton starting for the Panthers again after a really good game last week. Should be getting to a good amount of this game. Deontay Johnson, one of my highest owned guys at 38%. Fields getting to 24%, and I don't have any problems with it. He's a talented receiver. He's good at getting open. We didn't see production from him in the first couple of weeks because Bryce Young is horrible. We saw tons of production, tons of opportunities, 35% target share last week with Andy Dalton. Now you also don't have Adam Thielen, so there are, in theory, more targets, or at least a solidified target share for Deontay Johnson. He's still only $5,600. Looks really, really good here. He was targeted a lot around the goal line as well. Chuba Hubbard getting 22% ownership. I'm at 18%. He's $5,700. There are a couple of red flags here, I think, for Hubbard, but the price tag does still make him look good. Now, his ownership and my exposure may be impacted a bit by Joe Mixon being out. This is a spot where you probably see some of this Hubbard just kind of start turning into $5,300 Cam Akers as well. But the plus for him is that he got like 2/3 of the carries for Carolina last week. He was clearly involved. He had a really big game. The red flags are that they used Miles Sanders around the goal line, which obviously is not ideal. And also we saw less passing game work for Hubbard last week than we had in the first couple of weeks of the season. He only ran routes on about 20% of Andy Dalton's dropbacks last week. He had run routes on 44 to 45% of Bryce Young's in weeks 1 and 2. Miles Sanders ran routes on 31% of dropbacks last week. So Sanders actually ran more routes than Hubbard did. Neither running back was targeted a ton. Hubbard actually was targeted more than Sanders at 13%. So like, it's not that he disappeared from the passing game. He still caught passes. He still looks good, but it just is somewhat concerning that you saw Sanders take on a goal line role and you saw Sanders run more routes. If that continues going forward, it would be detrimental for Hubbard's passing game volume, most likely. But at 5,700, that's not a huge concern. It would be a bigger concern once you see that salary increase. So Hubbard does still look good here, but I did just kind of want to mention potential red flags that stood out from last week. Zach Moss also looks pretty good at 5,900, getting 12% of him. He continues to dominate touches in the Cincinnati backfield. We saw not only did he get the bulk of the carries last week, but also ran routes on 71% of Joe Burrow's dropbacks. Chase Brown only ran routes on 12%. In week 1, we had seen Moss run routes 43% of the time and Chase Brown run routes 34% of the time. So it seemed like Brown was just going to be that third down back and was going to play a pretty big passing game role. But since then, Chase Brown, 10% route participation week 2, 12% week 3, Moss, 58.5% week 2, and 71% week 3. So that is trending really, really well for Zach Moss. And then he's always been the clear number 1 running back. 60% market share on carries last week to 35% for Chase Brown, 54 and 56% in the 2 weeks before that. Chase Brown had been at about 18%. The big difference for Chase Brown, I think, was that Joe Burrow went from 25 and 27% to 5%. So it's clearly Zach Moss's backfield, and you are seeing him more involved in the passing game now too. So that looks good. Jamar Chase coming off the big game last week, still didn't draw a ton of targets, but obviously that's just going to increase going forward. It's Jamar Chase. We know how that's going to go. So I'm getting to 8% of him. He's 7,700. If I were to get a little bit more, that would be fine. The field is getting a little bit more. T. Higgins isn't showing up for me. He's not showing up for the field. This one scares me. Just like, I think I should have more. He was a full go last week. He ran routes on like 95% of snaps. He ran pretty bad in terms of fantasy production. He had like 14 to 15 expected fantasy points compared to only about 7 actual. Definitely left some points on the table. And he's only 5,900, not getting any ownership. So when I look at this, it looks like a spot that the field is just kind of missing on and that I want to get to first. That being said, I right now am not getting there. So kind of hoping that changes between now and lock. But yeah, I kind of just think Higgins is in a pretty good spot here. Jasicki, another one of the tight ends, same for Tommy Tremble at 2,700. You could see an increased workload for Tremble here, some extra targets without Thielen. Tremble has run about 43% of his routes from the slot this year, so no real confidence, but he is 2,700. Jonathan Mingo, 3,300, decent value play. I'm not getting quite as much as the field, who's coming in at 8%. I'm at 4. I expect him to be the biggest beneficiary without Thielen. He ran the second most routes on the team last week at about 66%. You could see Xavier Leggett involved as well, get an increased workload as well. He is $1,500 more than Mingo, though, which is also why Mingo is just going to be my preferred option because he is $1,500 less expensive. 67% route participation for Mingo last week. Deontay Johnson led the way at 90%. Mingo was second at 67. Tremble was third at 56. Leggett came in at 38.5. Thielen was at 43.5, but got hurt. So we don't know exactly how the wide receiver workload is going to go, but signs seem to point to Mingo being the guy that steps up the most, and he is also cheap at 3,300, which looks pretty good. Minnesota taking on Green Bay. This is a game that I think I'm getting to a pretty good amount in tournaments, more than the field. I don't love it, but it does have a relatively high total for the slate. It has a close spread. This game is just a game that could end up being competitive. 13% projected ownership coming into Aaron Jones. I'm at about 18%. We saw him have a huge game last week. He had the biggest gap that he's had so far this year in rushing market share between him and Ty Chandler, which is good to see. He was very involved in the passing game, and that's been the case the last couple of weeks. Now, you do have Jordan Addison back, which could cut into Jones' target share a bit, but still probably gets enough targets that, at 6,400, he looks pretty good here. So I like getting to him. Sam Darnold's only getting 2% ownership. He's been one of the best quarterbacks in the NFL so far this year. Whether or not that continues, who knows? But we do know that he has the best wide receiver in the NFL to throw to, and they're both pretty low owned. So 5,700 for Darnold, 8,700 for Jefferson. I like pairing them. They're each in 12% of my lineups. I assume that they are, So I don't have any Jefferson without Darnold. I don't have any Darnold without Jefferson. Not to say that you can't play Jefferson by himself. Obviously you can. He has a very high ceiling. But at the same time, if Justin Jefferson does give you a big game at 8,700, there's a very good chance that he's bringing along his $5,700 quarterback with him, just given how inexpensive Darnold is. So I do like having a high percentage of my Jefferson lineups with Darnold and vice versa. Packers defense, whatever, they're 3K. Josh Jacobs, 6,600. I'm right around the field on him at 8%. We saw Emmanuel Wilson have a bigger workload last week than he has so far this year, but I still expect this to be Josh Jacobs' backfield. You should have Jordan Love back, which should improve efficiency of this offense. Jordan Love showing up about 6% for me. Jaden Reed showing up 6%. The wide receiver group here is a mess as far as trying to predict or project their target shares. But I do think Reed is the guy that I would want to get to first. 6K is a very fair price tag. Also, Minnesota so far this season has utilized two high looks at the highest frequency in the NFL. So in theory, it should be pretty difficult for Christian Watson and Romeo Doubs to get a bunch of open looks on the outside. It can leave the middle of the field open for Jaden Reed, though. So for a couple of different reasons, I do think that when you're looking at Packers wide receivers, Reed is the guy that I would want to get to first. The tight ends here are kind of interesting, too, just given that the Vikings could leave some holes in the middle of the field. The problem is that we're basically just seeing a timeshare at tight end. Tucker Kraft had a lot higher route participation week 1 than Luke Musgrave did. That, of course, the last game that Jordan Love played. But since then, we have seen things kind of flatten out. Last week, 40% route participation for Kraft, 36% for Musgrave. The week before that, it was 53 to 35 in favor of Kraft. So if you want to take some shots on a 3K Kraft, I do think that's fine. But I am a little concerned by the fact that Musgrave is just running more routes now than he was the first week or two of the season. So that is a potential downside for Kraft. New England going into San Francisco. New England with the lowest team total on the slate, slightly edging out the Broncos. I don't have anything outside of like a Ramondre Stevenson lineup from the Patriots. I don't have a ton from this game. Debo's expected to play. Kittle's expected to return. So I'm not going back to Juwan Jennings here. And they just kind of are going to cut into each other's production enough that none of them look great. I do think getting to some Purdy stacks is fine. He's only 4% owned. The Patriots rush defense has been very good this year. They're top 5 in yards before contact allowed in a good way. So, maybe you do see the Niners throw the ball a bit, and obviously they do have talented pass catchers. It's just that the pricing is pretty efficient on a 7K Debo, $6,400 Ayuk, $5,500 Kittle, but stacking up a couple of them does make some sense in tournaments. I'm just not doing it a ton of the time. Jordan Mason's getting 26% ownership here. This one concerns me. I'm getting the 16%, so I still have a decent amount, but I am under the field, and I do expect to be under the field. 6,700 is just a really high price tag for somebody that's not particularly involved in the passing game and has a tough rushing matchup as well. As I mentioned, the Patriots rush defense is good. Jordan Mason is handling, the vast majority of the workload for the Niners. We did see more Isaac Guerrero last week than we had in previous weeks. So that is somewhat concerning just because, more of him obviously just means at least a little bit less Jordan Mason. But mainly it's just that he's 6,700. He's popular. And because of his lack of involvement in the passing game, you kind of need like a touchdown and 100 yards from him to be happy at all that you played him at 6,700, or a couple touchdowns or whatever. So it's just kind of easy for him to fail at this price tag and a little bit harder for him to put up a score that you have to have. So, he does still project pretty well for the salary, just given how likely he is to touch the ball and the fact that his team is a big favorite at home. But I probably will end up coming in a little bit below that 25 to 30% projected ownership on him. And I'm perfectly fine with that. There's no shortage of running backs that I like today. Now, the next game is the most appealing on the slate from a projection standpoint. If you're playing cash games, you should have a lot of this one. If you're playing tournaments, you can have a lot of it too. Just you have to find ways to be creative. I'm not getting a ton of this one, and it scares the shit out of me because I think it's a really good game to get to. But I do also think the ownership is just really, really aggressive in this game, especially when you consider that, like when you consider combinations in addition to just raw individual ownership. It's one thing to say, Brian Robinson's 15%, or Greg Dortch is 13%, or Michael Wilson's 14%, or Kyler's 16, Jaden Daniels is 18. All of that individually is fine, and you can work around it. The problem becomes when you have Kyler, so then you have Kyler, then you're pairing him with either Dortch, Wilson, Harrison, some combination of those guys. Everybody else that's playing Kyler is doing the same thing. So you end up just getting so much overlap in your lineups, in addition to the highly owned individual players, that I think that's kind of what is just pushing me away from this game a bit. I don't have any Jaden Daniels right now, which obviously I hate. I would love to be getting to him. The rushing upside is great. He's played great this year. We saw them finally, airing it out in the passing game last week also. But I'm not getting to him. I'm not getting to McLaurin, and it's an ownership thing. They obviously look really, really good. I am getting to the Cardinal side a bit more. Elijah Higgins at tight end with no Trey McBride, 3,100. So again, just a cheap tight end, 7% projected ownership. I'm a bit above the field there. I am getting to Brian Robinson in line with the field, $6,100 price tag. No Austin Eckler today. Brian Robinson is a capable pass catcher, so I do expect him to just step into a bigger workload and be involved in the passing game in addition to his normal role as the lead back. So I do like him at 6,100. The Cardinals run defense has been pretty middle of the pack in terms of yards before contact this year. But I do like the potential workload here for Robinson. James Conner in a good spot. So I do like that, even though I'm not getting to a ton of the Cardinals passing game, I am at least getting to Conner here. I am getting to the running backs. So I have exposure to the offenses here. It's just in a little bit different way than the field. And it goes back to the combinations thing too. Robinson and Conner are both pretty popular, but I can play them and just move on and have completely uncorrelated, unrelated plays elsewhere in my lineup. Whereas when you're playing the passing game, you're just taking 3-4 spots in your lineup and playing basically the same thing as 15 to 20% of the field. So this kind of creates a situation where there can still be points in this game, but if it's through Brian Robinson and James Conner, I'm in really good shape because I do have them and I don't have a lot of the pass catchers that everybody else has. You can see that I am getting to the Cardinals defense too. So again, it just, I don't like them. I don't think they're a great player or anything, but once I'm not playing a lot of the passing games here, I may as well be getting to the Cardinals defense and just hoping that this game goes in a completely different direction than than people are expecting it to, and then it most likely will. The upside to being there is just pretty high in these top-heavy tournaments. Greg Dortch, Michael Wilson, Marvin Harrison, all good plays, just not really showing up much for me. I will say that I like Dortch quite a bit here at 4,300 just from a matchup standpoint. I like all of the pass catchers. Washington can't cover anybody, so I don't think that what I'm about to say is a knock on Michael Wilson or Marvin Harrison, but from a 1 high versus 2 high frequency standpoint, Washington has played a lot more similarly to the Buffalo Bills this year than the Rams or the Lions. If you go back to week 1, we saw Greg Dortch dominate targets in that matchup with the Bills. And then, we saw Harrison dominate targets the last couple of weeks against the Rams and the Lions. So again, I'm not saying this as a negative for Harrison. He's probably going to torch whoever Washington puts on him. They just can't really cover anybody. But I do think you could see Dortch maybe a little bit more involved this week than he has been the last couple of weeks at 4,300. Still not getting to a lot of him. He is popular, but just wanted to mention that. So this is kind of one of those games where it's difficult to talk about because obviously, like every piece in this game is a quote unquote top play as far as chances of success and projection and all of that. But the problem is just in your larger field tournaments, you're going to run into so much overlap getting to this game that I just am getting to some other games more and then hoping that this one just ends up being an ugly game, I guess. Hopefully, a lot of rushing touchdowns or something like that, or defensive touchdowns for the Cardinals. Kansas City taking on the Chargers in LA as heavy favorites here. Rashee Rice is the only player from this game likely to get a lot of ownership. He's projected for 24%. I'm getting the 24%. He looks really good. Short ADOT combined with high target share just leads to a lot of receptions, high completion percentage because of the short routes. And then, obviously a really good quarterback in Mahomes as well. Clear number 1 wide receiver here. You've also had the Chargers run a lot of too high looks. So that shouldn't hurt Rice either. It's going to take away deep balls down the sideline. That's not really Rice's game. So everything here looks very good for him. He has at least a 24% target share in each game this year. He's been above 30% in week 1 and week 3. So very, very happy to get to him. I'm not really getting to much of anything else. I do think Ladd McConkey is interesting. He's getting 5% ownership. He's 4,800. You have somebody that's running a lot of short routes. So again, you should just be able to convert at a pretty high rate. He is getting a lot of targets. I think he's just kind of an interesting play at 4,800, but I'm not really getting there. Similarly, J.K. Dobbins, I don't have him, but there were some things that looked really good last week. We saw him separate from Gus Edwards as far as rushing market share goes. He had, in each of the first 2 weeks, he had a slightly lower rushing market share than Edwards. Obviously, he was more productive with those touches. Last week, 75% of the carries went to Dobbins, 15% went to Edwards. No idea if that kind of split continues, but if it does, obviously it's very good for Dobbins. He's looked very, very good so far this season. And then also he is their primary pass catching back in a game where they're likely to be playing from behind. So I do think you see a pretty solid workload for Dobbins here. It's just kind of a factor of there are so many good running backs. I'm still not getting there, but I did want to mention that there are some reasons for optimism in his workload stemming from last week. And then finally wrapping things up with a game that I'm getting a lot of, and I really wish I wasn't, particularly the side of it that I'm getting. Right now, getting to a lot of Cleveland Brown stacks, and I don't hate it, but also I obviously don't love it. It's Deshaun Watson. But you don't have Max Crosby here for the Raiders, so that, of course, is just going to weaken their pass rush, weaken their defense in general. This game is indoors, which is a bump for the Browns. Deshaun Watson's only $5,400, not getting any ownership. Amari Cooper, $6,300, only 5% owned. The Raiders have played a lot of man coverage so far this year. That is a benefit for Amari, assuming that they continue to do that. So I do like the Watson plus Cooper pairing. 80% of my Watson lineups have Cooper. Like 10% have Jerry Jeudy. I'm getting some Jordan Akins there too. So I'm fine with getting to this. I can see the ceiling. I just obviously don't feel very good about it because Watson's looked so bad. But he also has been plagued by drops a bit. And, he's not getting any ownership. He's cheap. I'll get to it, but not going to feel good about it until after it happens. And then hopefully I can victory lap it. Trey Tucker here, 16% ownership. I'm getting to 36%. $3,600 is a good price tag. No Devontae Adams. We saw the highest route participation of the season for Tucker last week, even with Adams active. And then now, should just see more routes, more volume without Adams. It's still volatile. He's a wide receiver. He can obviously disappear, but he is really, really cheap at 3,600. And then also he's probably, for me, being driven up by the fact that I am getting to the Browns because obviously he correlates here. So that works. Brock Bowers, I'm getting the 10%, Fields at 19. He's clearly a really good play at 5,600. He is likely to benefit without Adams. You have, more targets available. Also, Cleveland has had the best pass rush in the NFL so far this season. Bowers working as the short route guy can benefit him there also. So I do like him. I think it's just kind of an ownership thing and a tight end thing in general. Jerome Ford is an interesting one. $5,700 price tag. I am a bit over the field here. One, if the Browns are moving the ball, that's good for Ford also. But this is a situation that there's a lot of ambiguity in this Cleveland backfield, but it seems like it's probably Jerome Ford's backfield. We saw the really weird week 2 where Deontay Foreman played a ton, and I think even started that game. In week 2, Foreman had 48% of the carries. Ford had 24. But week 1, you had 63% of carries go to Ford. Foreman didn't get any. Last week, you had 56% go to Ford. Foreman got 11%. And then in the passing game, you've seen Ford be more involved also. The Raiders have been a weak rush defense in terms of yards before contact this year. They're allowing the most, tied with Philadelphia, for the most yards before contact to opposing ball carriers. So, I can't guarantee that Jerome Ford is dominating touches again this week. Maybe they're just doing a week-by-week thing, and it's an even week, so it's Foreman. I honestly have no idea. But at 5,700 and low ownership, I think there's a good enough chance that Ford is the running back 1 here in a good spot that I do like getting to him at that salary. Jordan Akins gives you a 3K tight end with no David Njoku, so just another cheap tight end that you can kind of throw darts at. Right around the field on Jacoby Myers, who obviously looks better without Adams. The reason that Myers isn't getting more ownership, and TDID mentioned it, he said, is it too Galaxy brain to play Myers at 2K more expensive than Trey Tucker? No, Myers is fine. He should get more targets. He should be more involved. Obviously, you do run the issue of, can the Raiders even move the ball because of Cleveland's pass rush and the fact that they're the Raiders without Devontae Adams. But he should, in theory, get more opportunities. The reason he kind of is just getting squeezed out is that Brock Bowers is that same price tag at a weaker position and likely to draw more targets than Myers. And then Trey Tucker is just 2K less. So Tucker just fits into more builds than Myers does. There's not a lot of other guys sub 4K that give you similar range of outcomes as Trey Tucker. There's no shortage of guys between 5 and 6K that give you the same range of outcomes as Jacoby Myers. So that's why you see ownership on Myers just not as high as on Bowers or Tucker, but still perfectly fine. Elijah Moore, 3,600. Getting to him a little bit more than the field. Not surprising since I'm getting to Watson. Moore is the clear wide receiver 3 for the Browns. He's running a ton of routes. He's not drawing a ton of targets, but he is out there running routes more than anybody other than Amari Cooper or Jerry Jeudy. So this looks like a game where, the 4 o'clock, everybody's going to be sweating the Arizona-Washington 4 o'clock game. I will be getting to sweat Deshaun Watson instead, which sounds absolutely miserable. But I do think it's a pretty decent spot here in Vegas. So I'm not too upset about getting to that one. Going to go through position by position and just recap. But as a reminder, sign up for Endgame Syndicate using the link in the description below. All of my content is there. My game-by-game notes, my NFL projections, optimal percentages, how often players are showing up in stacks with each quarterback when they're optimal. All that stuff is there. Also strategy and instructional videos from Utical, Brick75, Nerdy Tenor, helping you improve your process, get better at DFS, and make money more sustainably going forward. We have some other good stuff coming there as well. So check that out using the link in the description below. If you don't play enough volume that price tag makes sense for you, you can get access to just my content as well using the Dub Club link. There is also a 7-day free trial on that. So check out those links. But now recapping what I'm getting to. Deshaun Watson, my highest owned quarterback, if the slate started right now, followed by Darnold, Lawrence, and Fields, and then just kind of spread out on some other quarterbacks here. So you can see that by not getting to the really popular Kyler, really popular Jaden Daniels, I am able to get over the field on a lot of quarterbacks, which is nice. Keep in mind here, this is only showing you running backs that show up in the running back slot. So it's a little bit misleading, but Najee Harris showing up a lot, Kyron Williams showing up a lot, Aaron Jones, Chuba, Robinson, Mason, Barkley, Hall, Moss, Robinson, not going too crazy on weird running backs here. I am likely to be below the field on Jordan Mason, but I am still getting a bit. At wide receiver, Deontay Johnson, going to show up a lot. Nico Collins, Stephon Diggs, Amari Cooper as a contrarian play, Trey Tucker as a chalky value play, Christian Kirk, relatively contrarian, getting to Rice, getting to some Godwin, London and Mooney above the field on both of those guys. Tight end, getting to a ton of Dallas Goedert, and then mostly spreading things out. Elijah Higgins as a value play from that Washington game, one of the lower owned pieces in that game. Brock Bowers, I'm below the field, but still my third highest owned tight end. And then just really spreading things out with these cheap guys. Flex, again, just showing you guys that are showing up in flex. So, more Tucker there, more Rice. That's where I'm getting to some Connor, Jerome Ford. But defense, I'm getting to a lot of the Falcons and the Cardinals, which shrug, I don't really care. The Cardinals from like a game theory standpoint makes sense in the context of my lineups, even though they're not very likely to succeed. And then, beyond those two teams, pretty spread out at defense as I would usually expect. So that's all I have for this one. Don't forget to sign up using the links in the description below. Hit the thumbs up on your way out the door. And thank you for checking out the show. I'll be back at the same time next week. Good luck on your lineups today.